2.3 million blocks each, weighing as much as a car. That's the Great Pyramid. People imagine it cost treasure gold or divine inspiration, but its true price was measured in bodies. Farmers torn from their fields, debtors dragged from their homes, prisoners marched in chains. Who really paid for Egypt's eternal monuments? Chronicles praise the pharaohs. Archaeology, broken bones, and ration ledgers tell the truth. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. Imagine a village along the Nile in flood season. A scribe arrives with a decree. Names are read, families split, and men dragged into work gangs. For the pharaoh, this was not cruelty, but duty inscribed in law. The pyramid was never just a tomb, it was a political theatre of subjugation. Every stone shouted the king commands, not only death, but also the living. Archaeologists unearth this truth in fragments. Mass workers' graves at Giza. Spines shattered by hauling bones scarred from crushing accidents, bread and beer ration jars stacked like receipts of pain. The ledgers show a system labor as taxation food, as leash death, as acceptable loss. For the elites, eternity was cheap. For the workers, it was everything. The year is 2650 BCE, flood season, along the Nile. Crops vanish underwater, leaving farmers idle, or so the pharaoh's officials claimed. But this idleness was a fiction crafted by the state. In reality, villagers used the flood months for repairs, local rituals, and careful preparation for the year ahead. When scribes arrived with lists demanding men for labor gangs, it was not opportunity offered, but compulsion enforced. The raids were systematic. Officials marched into villages, with soldiers shouting out names inscribed on clay tablets. A man's tax arrears, a family's debt, even a petty crime could be paid in flesh. Families understood instantly what it meant months or years of absence, bones broken beneath stone, perhaps never returning. Children clung to their fathers' legs. Women wailed as men were chained together in lines. This was not the myth of willing devotion carved on temple walls. This was seizure disguised as service. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing 2 millennia later, spoke of 100,000 workers conscripted. Archaeology tempers his number, but not the cruelty behind it. Worker cemeteries near Giza reveal young men in their 20s with crushed vertebrae, fractured skulls, malnutrition etched in bone. These were not volunteers. They were captives of a system that blurred taxation and enslavement. Imagine the machinery soldiers moving downriver, scooping labor from village to village, hauling men north to Giza. Debt was weaponized, fall behind on taxes, and your body became the payment. Farmers whispered prayers as barges filled with human cargo moved toward quarries and construction ramps. Each conscript became both a statistic in a ledger and a body in perpetual danger. And yet the spectacle was not only about labor, it was humiliation codified. To be dragged from one's fields chained with strangers was to be publicly marked as expendable. Villagers left behind, absorbed the lesson power, could requisition human life as casually as it requisitioned grain. Submission became survival. Archaeological fragments confirm the reach of this system. Ostraka broken pottery shards used for notes contain ration records, loaves of bread, jugs of beer counted out per worker per day. They look bureaucratic, almost dull, until one notices what they conceal. Behind each number was a man snatched from home, surviving on the bare minimum required to keep his muscles moving. Bread was not food, it was fuel. Beer was not pleasure, it was anesthetic. These were rations for bodies, not meals for human beings. The raids also targeted foreigners. Prisoners of war from Nubia or Libya were funneled directly into labor crews branded as outsiders unworthy of dignity. In Egyptian ideology, this served two purposes: projecting the pharaoh's dominance over foreign lands and ensuring that Egyptians themselves could rationalize their suffering by pointing to those beneath them. A hierarchy of pain was carefully maintained, turning exploited farmers into overseers of enslaved captives. One can see the psychological strategy by forcing Egyptians and foreigners into the same system, yet ranking them differently. The state fragmented solidarity. Resistance became impossible when humiliation was distributed by degrees. Better to endure than to fall to the bottom. Better to break your back than to be branded as other. The shock lies not only in the scale, but in the normalization. What we call raids, the state called duty. What families experienced as terror scribes recorded as taxation. When a man did not return, his death was filed away as a line item loss, acceptable, replaceable. In this way, bureaucracy became the mask of brutality. Violence wore the costume of law, and the irony sharpened, while villagers were dragged to Giza priests, assured them that the pyramid was their bridge to eternity, that their sweat fed not only the pharaoh's afterlife, but the order of the cosmos itself. Religions sanctified what violence demanded. Consent was manufactured through fear wrapped in theology. So begins the cycle of the Pyramid Project raids, seizures, chains. Glory announced in stone, but built first on the broken silence of villages emptied of men. The question festers if the beginning of the pyramid was seizure. What then of its continuation? Did the violence fade at the worksite, or did it metastasize into an economy of flesh that sustained Egypt's eternal dream? The raids had dragged the men from their villages, but arrival at Giza revealed the true purpose of their capture, not simply to move stone, but to become living instruments of obedience. The pyramid site was less a workplace than a military camp. Barracks stretched in rows like an army encampment. Overseers enforced discipline with whips. Soldiers patrolled the perimeter, and scribes with reed pens recorded rations like officers counting ammunition. Every detail was designed to strip individuality and replace it with collective function. Bread and beer, so often romanticized in popular accounts, were not gifts of charity. They were ration chains carefully calculated to keep workers alive just enough to perform, never enough to feel secure. Ostraka list daily distributions, 3 to 4 loaves per man. 2 jugs of beer. It sounds generous until one examines the caloric math. The bread was coarse, filled with grit from grindstones, pads, that wore teeth to nubs. The beer was weak, more a sedative than sustenance. These rations were not meals, but tools of control. Deny them, and rebellion brewed. Provide them, and submission was maintained. A man's survival, his very ability to rise in the morning, depended on obedience to the system that held him captive. The construction process itself became theatre. Imagine standing in the desert heat, hauling blocks that dwarfed your body, while priests chanted hymns praising the king. Each stone lifted was a line in a performance that inscribed royal power into the landscape. The pyramid was not just architecture, it was stagecraft. To raise a block was to act in a drama whose audience was both the gods above and the villages below, watching smoke rise from the desert, where their fathers and sons vanished. The pharaoh's image loomed over the process. Reliefs and inscriptions framed him as shepherd of his people, protector of order, divine mediator. Yet the bodies crushed beneath limestone told another story. Power devoured the very lives it claimed to safeguard. The pyramid proclaimed eternity for one man by consuming the finite years of tens of thousands. This was the spectacle of obedience, the transformation of suffering into a monument, masquerading as devotion. Archaeology reinforces this reading. At the workers' cemeteries south of the pyramids, skeletons lie in neat rows, many, showing identical spinal fractures, compressed vertebrae from hauling stone. Some still bear copper tool fragments, broken blades buried alongside, as if the tools and men were interchangeable components. Their graves were small uniforms stripped of identity. Compare this to the massive tombs of nobles nearby, inscribed with names and boasting of feasts. The contrast was deliberate eternal individuality for the elite, eternal anonymity for the laborers. Even in death, obedience was staged. The pyramid itself functioned as a political theatre visible for miles. Villagers across the Nile Valley could see its rising silhouette, a daily reminder that the state could bend stone and flesh alike to its will. Its geometry was not only mathematical precision, but also psychological domination. A triangle of stone anchored in earth, yet pointing to heaven, proclaimed that Pharaoh's authority extended from cosmos to soil, and that every villager's labor had been consumed to prove it. Think of the procession of carts, sledges, ropes, and chanting gangs dragging a block across ramps. Each movement synchronized overseers shouting rhythm whips, cracking time. This was choreography. The worksite was a stage where power rehearsed its own myth. And like any performance, the audience was not only the gods, but the workers themselves, conditioned to see their suffering as necessary, inevitable, sacred. The spectacle reached its climax not when the pyramid was finished, but in the process of building it. Each new layer rising higher, each block locked into place, reinforced the message: obedience creates eternity. The pyramid was less about the afterlife of the king than the present life of his subjects. It was proof that resistance was futile, that the state could command not only stone, but the marrow of its people. Yet, beneath the chants and rations, murmurs persisted. Graffiti found in worker galleries reveal humor, defiance, even complaint. Teams nicknamed themselves the Drunkards of Menkaura, or the Friends of Khufu. These fragments suggest that workers sought slivers of identity in the face of enforced anonymity. But even their jokes became part of the spectacle, evidence that obedience was not merely demanded, but internalized, woven into daily survival. The lesson was brutal and clear. The pyramid was not only a tomb, it was a rehearsal of control, a public stage where obedience was extracted, displayed, and fossilized in stone. The question now presses harder. If the construction site was political theatre, then what of the system behind it? What hidden economy of stone and flesh kept this spectacle running? The pyramid rose block by block, but the true foundation was not limestone. It was the economy of flesh. Behind every stone, hauled into place, stood an invisible system of extraction taxes converted into rations, copper mined and sharpened into chisels, quarries carved into wounds in the desert, and above all, human bodies consumed as though endlessly replaceable. Consider the quarry at Tura, its gleaming limestone still bearing scars from copper saws. Workers cut blocks day after day, copper blades dulling within hours. To sharpen them, smelters demanded fresh ore from Sinai mines, an endless cycle of exhaustion, ore, and fire. Each broken tool meant more laborers dispatched to distant mines, more lives shortened under blows of hammer and heat. The logistics spread across Egypt like arteries carrying lifeblood toward a single beating heart at Giza. Transporting stone required fleets of boats along the Nile. Paintings on tomb walls depict neat rows of oarsmen hauling cargo, but the reality was less graceful. Men bent double under ropes dragging sledges across sand, pouring water to reduce friction. Their strained bodies became part of the equation. If a dozen collapsed, another dozen replaced them. Pharaoh's ledger did not record names, only totals. Flesh was treated as a commodity no less renewable than copper or timber. Bread and beer rationing reinforced the machine. Archaeologists studying storage silos at the Giza workers' village found evidence of grain processed at industrial scale. Thousands of loaves baked daily, hundreds of vats brewing continuously. This was not sustenance, but fuel measured precisely against labor output. Too little, and workers weakened. Too much, and they might resist. The balance was calculated as coldly as a modern factory budget. Taxes flowed into this system like tributaries feeding a river. Villages sent grain, cattle, linen, and pottery ostensibly as offerings to the gods. In truth, these were the inputs of pyramid production. The corvée labor draft was not separate from taxation. It was taxation in flesh. When harvests failed, taxes still demanded payment. The penalty for shortage was not mercy, but seizure of bodies. Fathers vanished from households, sons marched in their place. Egypt's economy of stone was a machine that transmuted private life into public monument. Numbers strip away illusions. The Great Pyramid alone required over 2 million blocks. Even if placed at the rate of 1 every 2 minutes, the work would take decades. Behind such figures lies a truth more terrible than any myth of aliens or lost technologies. The machine functioned because the state could treat tens of thousands of workers as expendable. The pyramid was an equation of suffering balanced on ledgers inked by scribes. Psychology played its role. Workers were told they served marked cosmic order. Priests assured them their sweat upheld harmony between heaven and earth. Yet, bones tell another story. Excavations reveal spines warped by carrying loads, arms broken, and poorly healed skulls with signs of blunt trauma. These men were not upholding harmony. They were being harvested, spent, and discarded. Their wounds were not accidents, but structural necessities of the economic system. One detail illustrates the cynicism of this economy replacement labor. When a man died, the village was expected to supply another. Death did not close the account. It merely reset the balance. Families already grieving were forced to surrender brothers or sons to fill the gap. Pharaoh's machine acknowledged mortality only to demand compensation for it. The illusion of glory blinded later generations. Inscriptions boasted of pharaohs feeding their workers of pyramids built in harmony with the people. But harmony cannot be measured by propaganda. It must be measured by the bodies beneath the sand. Their silence exposes the truth. This was not devotion. It was industrialized obedience. What makes this system truly chilling is its efficiency. Unlike chaotic raids or impulsive cruelty, the pyramid machine was organized rational and perpetual. It married logistics with theology, economics with death. It made obedience profitable, not just for kings, but for the bureaucrats, priests, and overseers who administered the flow of flesh. Violence was not random. It was systematized until it became invisible, indistinguishable from the rhythms of life itself. The question emerges with sharper edge if Egypt's economy could transmute human suffering into eternal stone. What does that reveal about the psychology of power itself? Was this merely architecture? Or was it the first blueprint for every empire that learned to turn life into ledger, pain into monument? If the economy of stone was the body of pyramid power, then law was its voice. Every lash of the overseer's whip, every loaf of rationed bread, every body bent under stone was sanctified not only by force, but by decree. Pharaoh's system did not rely on naked violence alone. It transfigured violence into obligation, issuing commands in the language of gods. Consider the corvée the labor draft imposed on villages. On papyrus rolls preserved from later dynasties, we read lists of names, ages, and quotas: 50 men from this district, 100 from that. The scribes did not write captured or seized. They wrote summoned, a word that cloaked coercion in the garments of legitimacy. To be summoned was not to be enslaved, but to fulfill duty. The difference was semantic, yet in that semantic gulf lay the justification of empire. Edicts carved in stone made the pyramids seem less like exploitation and more like ritual. One decree declared that all who labor on the horizon of Khufu shall be blessed in the afterlife. Another warned that failing to serve risked angering the gods themselves. In these words, Pharaoh blurred lines between civic duty and sacred obligation. Refusing to carry stone was not simply disobedience. It was cosmic treason, a fracture of Ma'at, the divine order. Temples amplified this narrative. Priests proclaimed that pyramids were offerings to Ra. Steps for the king's soul to ascend to the heavens. But behind the incense smoke was a more practical truth. Temples were among the largest landholders, funneling their resources directly into construction. They lent not only grain and cattle, but also ideological cover. A man beaten to exhaustion on the quarry floor was not a victim. He was a participant in ritual. A woman whose husband vanished into a labor draft was told he was chosen. In this theology, suffering was sanctified. Yet the very precision of the system betrays its purpose. Scribes recorded how many loaves, how many jugs of beer, how many days each man worked. Receipts from Middle Kingdom sites show fines imposed on villages that failed to supply their quota of laborers. These were not gifts to the gods. They were taxes in flesh, enforced with bureaucratic thoroughness. Pharaoh's government transformed lives into units of account. The psychological genius of this system lay in its inversion. What might otherwise be seen as exploitation was rebranded as privilege. To labor for Pharaoh was described as an honor, one that might earn a man burial in the workers' cemetery rather than abandonment in the desert. Inscriptions from overseers' tombs boast of their role in organizing the crews of the king's horizon. They do not mention whips, but their very pride reveals complicity. By obeying law, they legitimized violence. But bones speak against these illusions. Excavations at Giza have uncovered skeletons of men in their 20s, spines crushed, from bearing loads, knees ground down from dragging sledges. Many show signs of healed fractures as evidence. They returned to labour after injury because law demanded replacement, not relief. The decree did not care whether a man could walk. It cared whether his body could still be counted in the ledger. Even the language of contracts reveals the erasure of choice. Some Ostraka record promises that workers offered themselves for the king's horizon. But scholars know these were not free offers. They were formulaic declarations, scripted statements recited under pressure. Here the mask of law is clearest, the appearance of consent where none existed. This is where law merges with philosophy of power. Pharaoh did not need to shout threats in every village. The law shouted for him. The edicts etched on stone, the rituals performed in temples, the lists compiled by scribes, all conspired to make coercion invisible. Violence was not denied. It was bureaucratized. Once written, once sanctified, it ceased to look like violence at all. The true horror lies here, not just in crushed spines or broken bones, but in the way words converted suffering into duty. When law says obedience is sacred, disobedience becomes blasphemy. When decree transforms pain into devotion, resistance becomes unthinkable. That is the deepest form of control, not forcing the body, but colonizing the mind. And yet, beneath the legal inscriptions and ritual smoke, the cracks widen. Workers carved graffiti mocking overseers. Desertion rates appear in administrative records as unexplained absences. The law insisted labor was cosmic order, but the desert itself recorded defiance. Even within the machinery of decree, resistance flickered. The question sharpens. If law can sanctify suffering, if decrees can cloak coercion in cosmic language, then how do we distinguish justice from control? What happens when every word carved in stone is less truth than weapon? Stone alone did not build the pyramids. Flesh carried it. Law compelled it. But architecture controlled it. The irony is sharp. The very society that engineered monuments of eternity also engineered invisible cages of flesh and routine. Worker villages at Giza were not accidents of logistics. They were instruments of governance designed to regiment life so completely that even rest and hunger became tools of command. Picture the workers' settlement unearthed south of the pyramids, long rows of mud brick barracks, each room crammed with sleeping mats for dozens of men. No family, no privacy, no choice. Archaeologists found storage rooms stocked with bread and beer jars, rations dispensed not as kindness but as shackles. A man could only eat if he returned each evening to his designated cell. To leave the barracks was not merely to desert, it was to starve. Bread and beer became chains far subtler than iron. Overseers calculated portions with mathematical precision, a quota of loaves and jars per man tied to the hours of labor performed. Miss a shift, lose your ration. Refuse to work. Watch your children go hungry. The pyramid system did not need walls around every village. Hunger was the wall, and rations were the key. Even sleep was weaponized. Excavations reveal rows of identical sleeping platforms, each the same width, each aligned like the ranks of soldiers. This was not housing, it was barracking. Workers were treated less like citizens than infantry pressed into a campaign. Their bodies regimented in time and space. At dawn, horns or shouted commands roused them. At dusk, guards ensured return. The rhythm of their days was not their own. Control radiated from architecture outward. Guard posts overlooked entrances and exits. Roads were designed to funnel bodies toward the work sites. Kitchens doubled as checkpoints where rations were counted and loyalty measured. Even the latrines were communal, stripping away any illusion of private life. Every corner of these settlements said the same thing. You belong to Pharaoh, not yourself. And the pyramid itself loomed as a constant reminder. Imagine dragging stones by day, returning to your barracks at night, and seeing the monument grow higher, larger, swallowing the horizon. It was not just a tomb for a king. It was a stage for obedience. Each stone a message. Your labor is small, but together you build eternity. The pyramid rose not only from limestone, but from the broken backs of thousands, whose very exhaustion proved the king's divinity. The monument was propaganda in stone visible from miles away. Architecture also divided. Worker villages were not uniform across classes. Archaeologists uncovered larger houses with multiple rooms, better diets, and imported pottery for overseers. Their graves show fewer injuries, more jewelry, and inscriptions boasting of their role. Here, the system revealed its dual logic discipline for the masses, privilege for the collaborators. By rewarding a few with comfort, Pharaoh ensured loyalty from those who enforced discipline on the many. It was a pyramid, not just in stone, but in social structure. The psychological effect of such architecture was devastating. Barracks stripped individuality. Constant surveillance erased freedom. Even those not chained physically were chained mentally, their routines dictated by the built environment. When every wall reminds you of Pharaoh, resistance feels futile. It is not just your labor that is consumed, it is your imagination of an alternative life. Archaeological evidence underscores this reality. Skeletal remains show repetitive strain injuries, identical across hundreds of men, proving a system of routinized assembly line labor. Graffiti etched on barrack walls show crude drawings of overseers, mocked a whisper of resistance carved in secrecy. But those scratches also prove the claustrophobia. Even rebellion could only be expressed inside the cage. The architecture extended to punishment as well. Quarries nearby show evidence of holding pens, likely for those caught deserting. Some skeletons bear ankle damage consistent with hobbling, a brutal technique that crippled men for life, ensuring they could not escape again. Space was not neutral. It was punitive, designed to display the cost of disobedience. And always the pyramid loomed larger. Each tier completed marked not only architectural progress, but psychological conquest. To see the structure rise was to be reminded of your smallness, your expendability. Pharaoh inscribed his authority not just in stone walls, but in the daily routine of every laborer. The pyramid's shadow fell across the villages, a literal canopy of power. This is where architecture intersects philosophy of control. The pyramid project was not simply about moving stone. It was about moving people into alignment with royal will. The worker villages were extensions of the monument, each barrack a smaller block in the edifice of obedience. Pharaoh understood what empires across history have practiced, that to dominate space is to dominate flesh. But here, the open question emerges. If control was so total, how did cracks form? If every barrack, every ration jar, every guard post reinforced Pharaoh's will, how did whispers of resistance survive? Graffiti mocking overseers' skeletons, suggesting desertion fines imposed on villages. These fragments suggest that even in the most regimented architecture, defiance flickered. The cage was strong, but not perfect. And so the next chapter asks what happened when the system of control collided with the reality of human fragility, when bones snapped, when bodies broke, when silence fell not from obedience but from death. How did Pharaoh's machine account for the cost? The pyramid's project sold itself as divine order, a monument to eternity. But peel away the smooth limestone casing and you find a darker foundation. Bones, shattered spines, crushed, voices silenced. What the chronicles never mention, the skeletons scream. Violence was not an accident of the building process. It was woven into the system, a hidden tax levied on flesh. Step inside the excavations around Giza. Beneath the ruins of worker barracks lie mass graves. Rows of young men, many barely 20, interred, without care or ceremony. Their bones tell the story no scribe dared to carve into stone. Broken vertebrae from hauling blocks, shattered legs from stones slipping during transport skulls fractured by falling debris. These were not isolated tragedies. They were systemic casualties of a labor machine designed to consume bodies until they failed. Some skeletons show ribs cracked and never healed, meaning men worked until the moment of collapse. Others reveal infections from untreated wounds, gashes and fractures left to fester, killing slowly through fever. Archaeologists found evidence of primitive splints on some bones, suggesting that overseers permitted minimal medical care only if a man could be patched back together quickly and returned to the line. If he could not, he was discarded. The pyramid did not pause for his recovery. Pharaoh's eternity could not wait, and silence the most chilling evidence of all. Official inscriptions celebrate the pharaoh, the gods, the architects. They list the number of stones, the ritual offerings, the ceremonies of foundation. Nowhere do they record the names of those who died hauling blocks or quarrying stone. To kill a man with overwork was not even considered killing. It was erasure through omission. Laborers existed in the king's record only as numbers, quotas, units of flesh. Once they broke, they ceased to exist. Think about this inversion. The pyramids were engineered to preserve a single man's memory forever, but they annihilated the memory of thousands whose hands built them. The king's name blazes across eternity, while the workers' names were silenced, buried, erased. It is the philosophy of power distilled the glory of one, immortalized the suffering of many forgotten. But the bones remain stubborn. Archaeologists analyzing skeletal remains see patterns of stress that could only come from endless repetition: shoulders grooved by ropes, knees ground down by kneeling with heavy loads, spines bent unnaturally. These men lived and died inside a single motion pull drag lift. Their bodies became tools worn down like copper chisels. When the tools broke, new ones were conscripted. The silence of the official record is as revealing as the violence of the bones. Ancient Egyptian scribes recorded eclipses, famines, temple inventories in painstaking detail. Yet, not a word about the cost of labor. Why? Because silence itself was a technology of power. To omit was to erase. To erase was to absolve. Pharaoh could not be blamed for deaths that were never acknowledged. And so violence hid in plain sight, visible in bones, invisible in words. Some have argued that the pyramids were built by volunteers, rewarded with bread and beer as part of a sacred duty. The bones tear this myth apart. Volunteers do not end up in mass graves with shattered spines and untreated infections. Volunteers are not buried hastily without offerings like discarded tools. What the state called sacred duty was in fact systemic coercion. Consider the psychology of silence too. A worker watches his comrade crushed by a stone. There is no ceremony, no priest to honor him, no inscription. The body is carted away and replaced. What does that do to the survivor's mind? It teaches him his life has no more value than the stone he hauls. It conditions obedience not just through fear of punishment, but through the knowledge that resistance will leave no mark, no memory. To be silent was to survive a little longer. But silence never holds perfectly. Graffiti carved into quarry walls tells another story. One inscription mocks an overseer's name, twisting it into a crude insult. Another depicts a stick figure pulling a stone bent double, while a second figure, clearly an overseer, wields a whip. These sketches are not grand rebellions, but they are voices breaking through the silence. Small acts of defiance etched into stone when papyrus refused them. And yet even these voices risked erasure. Many graffiti were plastered over, scrubbed out. Official silence was aggressive, hunting down dissent even in joke form. Violence and silence worked together like twin gears. One broke the body, the other erased the memory. The pyramid rose on both. This system also weaponized spectacle. Injuries themselves became lessons. A man crippled by a falling block was not just a casualty, he was a warning to those still hauling. Overseers paraded punishment, made examples of exhaustion. The sight of a collapsed comrade was as effective as the crack of a whip. Violence was not hidden. It was displayed, but stripped of meaning, framed as inevitable. But ask yourself, if silence was so complete, why do the bones still speak? Why did some scribes slip hints into texts? Why did graffiti survive under plaster? Why did desert winds preserve skeletons that should have turned to dust? Because silence, no matter how rigid, always fractures under the weight of truth. And here lies the next question, pressing forward like a stone block dragged across sand. If the pyramid machine thrived on breaking bodies and erasing names, what happened when the scale of loss became too great to hide? What happens when the silence itself cracks under famine, under collapse, under memory that refuses to stay buried? The pyramid was never presented to the Egyptian people as raw coercion. It was draped in incense prayer and holy water. Violence was washed until it gleamed like piety. To turn chains into blessings, that was Pharaoh's true genius. Every block laid, every back broken, was cloaked in ritual transforming economic exploitation into a sacred theater of obedience. Foundation ceremonies reveal this clearly. Inscriptions and reliefs describe how the king, flanked by priests, stretched the cord, a sacred act of surveying land before building. But beneath the poetry lies something darker. Offerings buried alive under cornerstones, libations poured, not just of wine, but of blood. Archaeologists at Saqqara discovered foundation deposits containing animal bones and jars of grain mixed with ash signs of sacrifice. Some texts whisper of human victims buried beneath the first stones, so that their souls would guard the pyramid for eternity. If true, then the first bodies swallowed by the pyramid were not symbolic, they were real, sealed forever in limestone coffins. For Pharaoh, ritual solved a problem. How do you make the suffering of thousands appear not as brutality, but as devotion. The answer was to reframe labor as sacred duty. Priests blessed the workers before they marched to the quarries. Processions paraded tools as if they were divine relics. Bread and beer rations were described not as wages, but as offerings from the king to his faithful people. The men hauling blocks were not slaves, they were sons of Horus fulfilling cosmic order. Pain became prayer. Exhaustion became sacrifice. Consider the psychology. A man whose hands bleed on the ropes is told he is participating in the eternal battle against chaos, helping Pharaoh secure the sun's rebirth each dawn. To stop working is not just laziness, it is heresy, betrayal of the gods. Thus, religious language masked coercion, twisting suffering into piety. This is how power sanctifies itself, not merely by demanding labor, but by making you believe that your pain pleases heaven. The pyramid itself was a ritual object. Every alignment mattered. Its base was squared, with the cardinal points its sides angled toward the stars. To the common laborer, this was proof that their sweat had cosmic significance. The overseer could point to the horizon and say, "You are aligning with eternity." Yet, what was really aligned was the worker's body with Pharaoh's will. The stars became camouflage for exploitation. Ritual also justified death. Injured laborers discarded into mass graves were sometimes buried with small offerings, a jar of beer, a loaf of bread, a shard of pottery painted with a blessing. These were not comforts, they were disguises, props to suggest their deaths were part of a holy cycle. In truth, they were consumed and erased, their bodies recycled as fuel for the monument. But ritual blurred the line between execution and devotion. The pyramid devoured them, and priests called it worship. Archaeological finds reveal how deeply ritual was woven into this system. At Giza, caches of miniature tools and figurines were found buried near worker barracks. Official inscriptions framed them as protective charms. But the placement tells another story, tokens designed to sanctify the very architecture of control. Even the barracks' cages of flesh were baptized in ritual to make them feel like shrines. This is the philosophy of power control is strongest when it feels holy. Think too of spectacle. When Pharaoh appeared at the work sites, it was not as a tyrant but as a living god. Trumpets sounded, incense rose, prayers were recited, workers were ordered to cheer, to chant hymns. In that moment, the pyramid was not just stone, it was a stage. Pharaoh stood atop a half-finished tier, surveying thousands of laborers, each a dot in a cosmic drama. The suffering of bodies was hidden under the choreography of ritual. The pyramid was built as much in the theatre of obedience as in the quarry. And yet ritual is a double-edged sword. By sanctifying violence, it left behind traces too dangerous to erase. Foundation deposits, carved reliefs, sacrificial pits, all evidence of brutality wrapped in piety. What priests intended as symbols of eternal devotion now expose the raw machinery of power. Archaeology strips the incense away, showing that holy spectacle was built on human agony. The philosophical cost is staggering. Rituals of power did not simply exploit the body, they colonized the mind. A man convinced his labor is sacred no longer resists. A family told their son died in service to Pharaoh's eternity no longer curses the king they weep and call it divine. Control achieved through whips breaks the body. Control achieved through ritual breaks the soul. But this raises a darker question. If Pharaoh could turn forced labor into holy spectacle, what happened when faith faltered? What happened when famine struck, when rations failed, when the sacred bread became a crust too small to feed a child? Could ritual still sanctify hunger? Could chants still drown the sound of rebellion? That is where we must go next, into the cracks of the system where resistance flickered and memory was chiseled out. If the pyramid was built on obedience, what happens when silence breaks and defiance leaves its mark? Power always pretends to be eternal. Pharaoh's monuments rise from the desert as if unchallenged, unbreakable. But beneath the stone whispers remain. Even in the most controlled systems, resistance flickers like embers in ash. Workers may have been silenced in chronicles, but their anger scratched itself into walls, left fragments of defiance hidden in the cracks of the machine. Pharaoh's scribes erased rebellion, but archaeology resurrects it. Take the graffiti at Giza, scrawled in red ochre on blocks never meant to be seen. Workers mocked their overseers with nicknames like the drunkard or the dog. Other gangs gave themselves ironic titles, the Friends of Khufu, the Drunkards of Menkaure, as if to mock the absurdity of calling back-breaking labor friendship to a king who consumed their lives. Some even carved jokes, crude images of donkeys in place of overseers, subverting the official script of piety. To the state, such gestures were invisible. To us, they are rebellion, preserved in stone. But resistance went further. Excavations reveal evidence of desertions, worker barracks, suddenly abandoned tools left half-finished bread, molds shattered in haste. The official records remain silent, but archaeology suggests moments when gangs simply walked away. Pharaoh's solution: ruthless erasure. Reliefs show the king striking down rebels labeled as foreigners, but what if those enemies were not outsiders? What if they were his own workers, recast in stone as faceless foes? To acknowledge rebellion within the pyramid system was too dangerous. So Pharaoh rewrote them into myths of foreign invasion. Violence was hidden by narrative. Even death became a site of resistance. Some skeletons bear signs not just of accident, but of deliberate injury, broken legs that suggest punishment, perhaps for defiance. Others were buried without offerings, excluded from ritual deposits. Archaeologists interpret this as lower status, but could it also be condemnation? Workers who defied the system, stripped even of false sanctity, erased from the holy narrative of labor. Their silence was engineered a final punishment. Psychologically, this erasure was crucial. Pharaoh's control depended not just on obedience, but on memory. By chiseling out graffiti, by silencing desertions, by recasting rebels as foreigners, the state ensured that the pyramid's story remained unbroken. Labor as devotion, obedience as eternity. In this way, power did not merely control bodies. It colonized history itself. To rebel was not just dangerous in life, it meant annihilation in memory. The greatest fear in Egypt was not death, but erasure. And Pharaoh wielded that fear as a weapon sharper than copper chisels. Yet the bones contradict the silence. Excavated cemeteries near workers' villages reveal trauma patterns, fractures consistent with falls, but also injuries suggesting beatings, punishments, deliberate cruelty. The state's silence collapses under the weight of archaeology. Each skeleton speaks. This was not devotion freely given. It was obedience extracted under threat. The official story pyramids as monuments of unity shatters when we listen to the evidence of pain written in bone. This duality spectacle, above silence below, was Pharaoh's balancing act. On the surface, the pyramid gleamed white in the sun, a beacon of eternal order. Beneath barracks held graffiti of mockery graves, held the erased cracks, held whispers of refusal. The pyramid's true structure was not just limestone, but tension between obedience enforced and rebellion suppressed, between memory manufactured and truth buried. And here lies the philosophy of power. Authority is not sustained by violence alone. It requires silence. It requires erasure. To endure, Pharaoh had to ensure not just that rebels were punished, but that rebellion itself was forgotten. To leave even a trace would be to admit fragility. That is why no official inscription records a strike. No temple text acknowledges desertion. The greatest project of all was not building pyramids. It was burying the memory of those crushed beneath them. But the question lingers, can silence ever hold forever? Can erasure truly outlast truth? Archaeology bones graffiti suggest otherwise. Pharaoh's control ended at the tomb, but fragments of resistance survived to speak across millennia. What power worked hardest to erase now defines the story. The irony is brutal. Pharaoh's name endures, yes, but so too do the scratches of workers who mocked him, the fractures in bones that betray him, the silence that refuses to remain silent. And so as we step into the next act, the focus shifts. For if resistance could not topple Pharaoh, famine would. If rebellion could be erased from chronicles, collapse could not. What ritual could sanctify hunger? What hymn could disguise a failing Nile? When the economy of flesh broke down, the system cracked from within, and in those cracks, truth seeped out. The pyramids seemed eternal. White limestone blazed in the desert sun, monuments proclaiming the pharaoh's triumph over time itself. But stone can outlast flesh only for so long. Beneath the gleaming facade, the machine that fed these monuments, the corvée labor system, the taxation of grain, the endless drafting of bodies, was fragile. And when the Nile faltered, so too did the empire of obedience. The Old Kingdom's collapse was not sudden thunder. It was slow suffocation. Archaeological records tell us of years when the Nile's annual flood came too low. Grain harvests shrank, and what little remained was siphoned upward to maintain temple rituals and construction projects. Imagine the cruel irony while villages' starved resources were diverted to drag more limestone to brew beer rations for work gangs. The pyramid machine consumed even as the people withered. At first, Pharaoh's priests framed famine as a test of faith. The king was the mediator between gods and Nile. If floods failed, the people were told to work harder, to sacrifice more. Obedience, not rebellion, was preached as the cure. But hunger has its own truth. Skeletons from late Old Kingdom cemeteries show stunted growth signs of chronic malnutrition. Children with bone lesions from starvation. The people carrying stones for Pharaoh were literally hollowed out by hunger. As famine deepened, cracks spread through the political structure. Nomarchs, the provincial governors who once bent to Pharaoh, began hoarding local grain to feed their districts. Pharaoh's decrees still demanded workers and taxes, but caravans grew smaller, sometimes never arriving at all. Authority fractured. The pyramid state had stretched itself too thin. Pharaoh could no longer enforce obedience across a starving land. Official inscriptions remain silent about this breakdown. But the silence is louder than words. Temples that once inscribed every act of royal generosity leave gaps during these years. In place of abundance, we find absence. Archaeology fills the void villages, abandoned bread ovens, cold desert tracks unused. It is as if the machinery of command simply ground to a halt, invisible in text, but obvious in ruin. Even the Great Pyramid project stopped abruptly. Half-finished monuments rise like broken teeth from the desert testimony to a state that lost the power to command. Blocks lie abandoned mid-quarry, copper chisels rusting where workers once stood. These are not symbols of completion, but of collapse. Pharaoh's dream undone not by rebellion, but by hunger and exhaustion. Psychologically, the failure was catastrophic. For centuries, the pyramid system had been framed as eternal order Ma'at incarnate in stone. To question it was to question the cosmos. But when famine persisted, when Pharaoh's mediating power seemed broken, faith faltered. If the Ming could not summon the flood, was he still divine? If the gods demanded endless labor, but gave no bread, were they still protectors? The ideological foundation cracked along with the political one, and so rebellion long erased finally surfaced. Local leaders declared independence. Nomarchs fortified towns, commanded militias, and in some cases inscribed their own triumphs in stone acts unthinkable under a strong pharaoh. Egypt did not fall to foreign invasion. It imploded from within as famine shattered faith, and faith was the true mortar binding Pharaoh's rule. The collapse had a human face. Families sold children into servitude for a handful of grain. Communities abandoned ancestral lands, leaving behind empty villages swallowed by sand. Starvation drove theft. Theft brought punishment. Punishment filled hastily dug graves. The machinery of obedience became a machinery of desperation. Even Pharaoh's bodyguards deserted in search of food. The pyramid, once the greatest monument of control, now stood as a monument to failure. Immovable stone surrounded by a people too weak to feed themselves. And here lies the bitter paradox. Pharaoh succeeded in building eternity into stone, but in doing so, drained the society meant to sustain him. The monuments endured, but the state collapsed. The Old Kingdom fell into what historians call the First Intermediate Period, a century of famine, chaos, and fragmentation. Egypt fractured into rival chiefdoms. Central authority disappeared. Writing itself nearly ceased. Pharaoh's dream of eternal memory ended in silence. Yet, even in collapse, the system's logic persisted. Later dynasties would rebuild, reorganize, and once again demand labor for temples and tombs. The ideology survived, but in scarred form. The lesson written in famine was clear. Monuments could not stand on starving foundations. Later rulers scaled back balancing spectacle with survival, at least until new cracks appeared centuries later. The collapse forces us back to our governing question. Were pyramids built as acts of devotion or as machinery of control? The evidence of famine, desertion, and fracture tilts the answer. Devotion does not starve its devotees. Piety does not erase rebellion. What we see in the Old Kingdom's collapse is the truth behind the stone. The pyramids were not eternal gifts to gods. They were temporary prisons built out of human labor, and when hunger came, the locks broke. The monuments remain, but the society that built them fell apart. Stone endured flesh, did not. And yet, bones tell us the story. Starved skeletons, unfinished quarries, silent villages, they are the real monuments of the pyramid system. Pharaoh's inscriptions say nothing of collapse. Archaeology screams it. But the story does not end in famine. For in the silence of collapse, traces survive. Skeletons reveal diet DNA, reveals origins. The erased are resurrected not as Pharaoh's subjects, but as individuals once forgotten. The next act turns to them the bones and genomes that tell what the state tried hardest to erase. When Pharaoh fell silent, the bones began to speak. For centuries, the official inscriptions told only one story. Pyramids as eternal devotion kings, as gods, labor as joy. But the sand does not lie. Archaeology has unearthed thousands of skeletons from workers' cemeteries at Giza, Saqqara, and Abusir. They are the voices Pharaoh tried hardest to erase, and they do not echo devotion. They speak of hunger, exhaustion, and broken flesh. The bodies tell us what no scribe dared write. Many skeletons belonged to men in their 20s and 30s, young lives cut short, spines compressed from years of hauling blocks, fractured limbs that never healed properly, suggesting workers were sent back into labor before recovery. Skulls with signs of blunt force trauma, possibly punishment or accidents. Some bare-cut marks from hasty amputations, attempts to save men crushed by stone. These are not the markers of volunteers joyfully offering service to the gods. They are the wounds of bodies consumed as tools. Yet, there is complexity. These same cemeteries also reveal that some workers received medical care. Broken bones were set. Infections treated with honey and herbal poultices. Bread and beer were distributed regularly, not as gifts, but as rations. Pharaoh sustained his laborers, but only to the extent that they could continue working. Medicine was not compassion, it was maintenance. Workers were not people. They were investments to be repaired and returned to the quarry. Flesh was a resource renewable until it snapped. And DNA now sharpens the picture. Studies of skeletal remains have revealed origins of the pyramid builders. They were not just locals from Giza. They came from villages hundreds of miles away, Upper Egypt Delta settlements, even Nubian outposts. The genetic mosaic proves what texts obscure Pharaoh's reach, dragged bodies from across the Nile Valley. The pyramids were not the work of a single city, but of an entire land pressed into service. Egypt itself was mobilized. Its villages emptied season by season, its diversity consumed by stone. Dietary analysis deepens the story. Isotope studies show shifts in nutrition workers consumed more protein than ordinary villagers, likely from cattle supplied at state-run camps. But this abundance was not privilege, it was necessity. High protein rations fueled the brutal labor of dragging 2-ton blocks. Pharaoh fed his workers like oxen to maximize endurance. The bread and beer inscribed in tomb scenes as symbols of divine generosity were in reality the ration chains of control. Archaeology also recovers individuality. A skeleton found at Giza belonged to a man with severe scoliosis. His spine bent, yet his burial was careful, laid with bread molds and pottery jars. Another was a teenage boy, his pelvis fractured, buried hastily without offerings. Each bone is a fragment of biography erased from the king's script. Together they tell a collective story, not eternal glory, but expendable lives. And yet even in death, the system sought to control memory. Many workers were buried near the pyramids in neat rows, as if to fold their bodies into Pharaoh's monument. The message even in death, you belong to me, but DNA analysis resists that claim. It reveals lineages that stretch back to villages far from the capital, to families who never carved their names in stone, but whose bloodlines survived. The bodies say we were not pharaohs. We were fathers' sons, brothers, stolen from the Nile's villages. The irony is brutal. Pharaoh sought eternity through inscriptions that erased his workers. Yet, it is modern science bones isotopes DNA that resurrects them. Pharaoh's name was never meant to fade, but in truth, his monuments tell less about him than about the flesh he consumed. The workers nameless in his time now return in detail their diets, their injuries, their origins. Their erasure has failed. The bones have overturned the silence. This shift forces us to reconsider the governing question. Were pyramids devotion or control? The evidence is stark devotion, leaves hymns, not fractures. Piety feeds souls, not quarries. Control, however, leaves exactly what we see: broken spines, ration jars, graves of young men who should have lived longer. The bones resolve. What the inscriptions deny, the pyramids were machines of control, masquerading as monuments of faith. Yet, this resurrection of memory cuts deeper. It shows that history's silence is never final. Pharaoh could erase graffiti, silence rebellion, bury dissenters. But he could not erase calcium. Bones remember. DNA remembers. Archaeology pulls back the curtain on power's greatest lie, that it alone decides what will be remembered. In truth, the body itself preserves testimony, waiting for someone to listen. And so we approach the final act. The bones speak, but their message must be tallied. The pyramids were not marvels of unity, but ledgers of pain. The question that opened this story, devotion or control, now demands a final reckoning. What do these monuments mean when we accept the testimony of bones over the lies of kings? The answer lies not in stone inscriptions, but in the silent ledger of suffering. When the last stone was set, Pharaoh believed the story was sealed. He had inscribed eternity in granite, silenced dissent beneath hieroglyphs of devotion, erased every name but his own. But power never owns the final word. Bones speak longer than stone. DNA outlives decree. And the ledger of suffering always comes due. The pyramids present themselves as miracles of faith, colossal stairways to the gods. Yet, strip away the illusion, and what remains is an accounting system. Every block lifted was bought with hours of stolen labor. Every gleaming casing stone reflected not divine light, but human exhaustion. The pyramid is less a temple than a ledger carved in limestone, inputs of flesh, outputs of power. The governing question returns: were these monuments acts of devotion or engines of control? The answer is visible in the system's structure. Devotion does not demand quotas. Piety does not calculate rations of beer by liters per back broken. Faith does not fracture spines or turn famine into labor surpluses. Only control does that. Pharaoh did not merely build monuments. He weaponized devotion, transforming religion into a technology of obedience. Consider the economics. The corvée system that drafted peasants into labor was presented as holy duty. But inscriptions from granaries show the truth. Villages were taxed in bodies, the same way they were taxed in grain. Men became quotas. Families paid the state not just with harvest, but with sons. This was not faith. This was a taxation system perfected in stone. Pharaoh understood that control was not just about armies, but about converting labor into spectacle. The pyramids were propaganda. They made obedience visible in the most permanent form possible. To stand before millions of stones stacked sky high was to confront proof that Pharaoh could mobilize the Nile itself. Every villager who saw the rising monument understood your body is a brick in his eternity. The monument was not a tomb. It was a message. Obedience leaves no escape. And yet the irony cuts deep. Pharaoh's eternity crumbled. The pyramids still stand, but the ideology they proclaimed collapsed. Dynasties ended, temples fell, gods lost their worshippers. The kings who enslaved villages are now known mostly through fragments. Their power dissolved. What survived, instead, were the bones of their workers, erased, then resurrected now. In this reversal lies history's cruelest justice. Pharaoh achieved his immortality only by accident, as the background to the very people he sought to erase. But this is not just archaeology, it is philosophy. The pyramids show how power rewrites morality. By labeling exploitation as piety, Pharaoh made cruelty seem sacred. By turning rations into gifts, he disguised chains as generosity. By inscribing eternity in stone, he attempted to erase the cost in flesh. This is the deepest function of power, not simply to command, but to decide which suffering counts and which disappears. The pyramids remind us that oppression often wears the mask of devotion. Modern parallels are unavoidable. We still build monuments, stadiums, skyscrapers, mega projects on the backs of invisible labor. Migrant workers collapse in desert heat. Names vanish, while concrete towers proclaim national glory. Pharaoh's system was not anomaly, it was blueprint. The pyramid teaches us that power's greatest trick is to transform exploitation into spectacle, and then call it civilization. So when we stand before these monuments today, what should we see? Not just marvels of engineering, not just tourist wonders, but ledgers of pain. 500,000 lives ground into stone, villages emptied spines, broken families fractured. Pyramids are not silent tombs, they are balance sheets of violence. Each block is an entry, each grave is a cost. The true inscription is not in hieroglyphs, but in fractures, malnutrition, and the genetic shadows carried into the present. The open loop closes here. The pyramids were never about gods. They were about Pharaoh's will. His ability to transmute devotion into control flesh, into stone. Silence into propaganda. The architecture was not just for the dead king, but for the living subject who looked up in awe and felt small, expendable, obedient. In this, the pyramids succeeded perfectly. They rewrote human suffering into symbols of eternal order. But eternity always falters. Hieroglyphs fade, dynasties vanish. What remains is not Pharaoh's name, but the testimony of those he tried to erase. Archaeology, DNA isotopes. They resurrect the workers he silenced. Their story is not devotion. It is coercion, not worship, but control. And in this lies the truth of empire. Glory is never free. Someone always pays. The final line belongs not to Pharaoh, but to those who carried his stones. Their bones remain mute yet eloquent. They remind us that history is not written only in chronicles or monuments, but in scars, in fractures, in DNA strands passed silently through generations. Pharaoh's script closed with his death, but their ledger endures. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak.